Happy Election Day. It's the 5th of November. Remember the 5th of November. It's about 11 o'clock in the afternoon here. It's a Tuesday, and we're talking about Mega Dungeons. I'm the OGGM, broadcasting live from Site B on a windy Santa Ana Tuesday with many gardeners around, so our talking might be interrupted by the... Please stay safe and sane out there on Election Day. We're talking about Mega Dungeons. I'm not sure why we're talking about Mega Dungeons, but the collective unconsciousness of the gaming community has rolled onto Mega Dungeons. I talk about Mega Dungeons every month. It doesn't start a fad, but Harmony Ginger casually mentions a Mega Dungeon, and suddenly everybody's like, oh yeah, Mega Dungeons, those are a thing. Let's talk about them. So let's talk about Mega Dungeons. Now, Harmony just did a big 2-hour video about it, so I'm not going to try and step on her toes with some other people. So I've included the link down below. I'm just going to sort of add my 2 cents since I talk about this topic like every March. Why wasn't I invited, Harmony? Aren't they cool enough? I'm not bitter. Yes, I am. So let's take it down to its basics. What's the difference between a dungeon and a mega dungeon? Is it just size? Is there a certain amount of rooms where suddenly it goes from normal dungeon to mega dungeons? Like if it's got less than 100 rooms, it's a dungeon. But if it's got over 100 rooms, it's a mega dungeon. Is that what defines it? No, because there's plenty of large adventures with over 100 rooms that I would not say are mega dungeons. I would remind you that there is no scientific theory behind this. It's all opinion. So what my opinion is and what their opinion is, it would probably be completely different, but this is just my opinion. So first and foremost, a dungeon tends to be on purpose, while mega dungeons kind of happen by accident. Nobody sets out to make a mega dungeon. Even Moria, probably one of the most famous mega dungeons in fiction. It's not like they set out to make it that big. They started with an idea and it kept growing. So mega dungeons tend to happen by accident. Dungeons tend to be specific. What do I mean by that? So a dungeon tends to be specific. The infamous Tomb of the Lizard King had a very specific job. We're building a tomb to bury the Lizard King, and then stuff happens that cause adventurers to go in. The pyramids, very specific reason they were built. The Louvre, very specific reason it was built. The necropolises under France, very specific reasons. Dungeons tend to be built for a specific reason. Even caves and caverns that we would say are dungeons, or mines, which we would say are dungeons, were all sort of built for a reason, or in the case of caves and caverns, happen because of science. Right? So that's the first thing, is a dungeon tends to be very specific. Mega dungeons tend to sort of be happy accidents. 2, dungeons tend to be finite. Even some of these multi-room, multi-level dungeons that people are saying are mega dungeons aren't mega dungeons. Like Daniel from Drivings and Dragons would say that the Temple of Elemental Evil is a mega dungeon. I would say, no, it's not. Hi, Cat Monroe. Dungeons tend to be finite. Temple of Elemental Evil is finite. Mega dungeons tend to be fluid. What do I mean by that? Well, in a dungeon, again, we'll use the make-believe Temple of the Lizard King. I think I have to eventually make this adventure now, don't I? The Temple of the Lizard King has a very specific story to tell. Once it tells that story, that finite story, there's really no reason for you to go back. You've cleared it out. You've gotten all the treasure. The threat's taken care of. Unless you're planning on like selling the real estate or turning it into a base or something, or repopulating it and turning it into your own dungeon. It's done. It's told a story. Dungeons tend to be finite. Even some of the big ones, like some people would say Barrier Peaks. Very, very big, like over 300 rooms. Temple of Elemental Evil, very, very big, considered by many to be a mega dungeon. But they both all have very specific stories to tell, and once that story is done being told, there's no real reason to return. So that would be, in my opinion, the second thing that justifies the existence of a dungeon. A dungeon tends to be built on purpose, and a dungeon tends to have a very specific story to tell. And once that story is told, it's done with. You don't really have to go back unless it's got another story to tell 14 years later, like, Mines of Phandelver. Mega dungeons, on the other end, tend to be fluid. So this is the things that define mega dungeons. Yes, mega dungeons tend to be large. Mega dungeons tend to happen by accident. Nobody's sent out to build the mega dungeon. They started doing one thing, and then it just sort of grew. And then each generation added to it. And, maybe while they were doing the one thing, they knocked over a wall and discovered some more things. And then they were like, well, we got to go explore these things. And it just sort of happened and happened and happened. And next thing you know, you've got Castle Greyhawk. Next thing you know, you've got Moria. Next thing you know, you've got Rapanathuk. It just sort of happened by happy accident that it kept growing and changing and evolving. So that's one of the things. Now, another thing is mega dungeons tend to have a fluid story. They don't just have one story. They got a bunch of stories. And you maybe don't always get the whole story every time you go in. So mega dungeons that, give you a reason to keep going back, because there's more to explore. There's more to the story. There might be several stories going on, which require you to leave and come back. A mega dungeon might have multiple entrances, multiple exits that might even not seem connected. You might find an entrance in a cave system and then think, oh, well, we've explored this entire cave system. And then a couple of days later, you're exploring an old tomb. Somebody knocks aside a secret door. Suddenly there's stairs. And then you're in some other things. And then you're like, explore. And then you're like, wait a minute, this looks kind of familiar. So there's that fluidness, that sort of amorphous size. Mega dungeons can just sort of pop up out of nowhere because of their size and because of the fact they're fluid. They're constantly changing the story. Constantly, the reasons for you to go to the mega dungeon will be multiple, because there's multiple things going on, because there's multiple stories. So you'll have multiple reasons. You could run entire campaigns built around just trips into the different aspects of a mega dungeon. There could be multiple baby dungeons that are actually parts of the mega dungeon that you don't realize are parts of the mega dungeon till later on. A lot of the early Gygax modules were just him taking chunks of his bigger stuff and presenting it in smaller, easier to digest productions and then he was like, oh, actually this was room, Island of the Ape was actually part of Castle Greyhawk, but he produced it as a separate product. But whatever, I'm just sort of spitballing here. There's no direction. But a mega dungeon tends to be fluid. A mega dungeon tends to have more stories going on than just one. Mega dungeon gives you reasons to return. That can be an entire campaign. You don't really know how big the mega dungeon is. You don't really always know what's going on. Another thing, dungeons tend to be built around a specific theme. Mega dungeons kind of just tend to be all over the place. Like in the Temple of the Lizard King, everything you encounter should be reptile related. Everything you encounter if you're exploring the Louvre should be built something to do with art or the Louvre or the running of the Louvre or the parking lots, right? You're not going to wander around the Louvre and suddenly discover an arcade or a movie theater. Well, actually, they do have a movie theater for scratch that, but you're not just going to suddenly discover something that has absolutely no reason to be there. Like, I'm in the Louvre. I expect to see works of art and statues and paintings and art and history. And what is that? And why is it here? So when you go in the Mines of Phandelver, you expect to run into mine stuff, and everything should look like a mine, right? You go into a mega dungeon, you don't know what you're going to run into because it's large and because there's a lot going on and because there's multiple stories and because all these happy accidents have happened. Goblins have come in because at some point in time they broke into a goblin cave. Another level got flooded, and then sea life started coming in because at one point in time there was a flood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Adventuring parties have come in and, you know, left members behind or died and been animated as skeletons or whatever. So the themes of the Mega Dungeon will tend to be more fluid. They won't be built around a very specific idea. And because the Mega Dungeon has lots of different stories going on and lots of different sections, you could run into a multitude of different monsters that at first seemingly have no connection, giving you, the DM, that mystical chance to throw things in that you maybe never have had a chance to throw things in before because you didn't have a place to put them. But in a Mega Dungeon, well, you can sort of explain why that's there, even if it's something completely bizarre, like why is there a cockatrice? I don't know. I just always wanted to have them fight a cockatrice, and it's a Mega Dungeon, so I can come up with some, you know, it wandered in through a cave or whatever. Factions is another big thing you'll hear mentioned in Mega Dungeons, and Harmony and her friends talk about that a lot in their video. Because they're dealing with a very large place that has some kind of fluid history, there's a chance that multiple different individuals have taken root. And these multiple individuals will often unite to form a tribe or a cult or a faction. So, you know, we could have the Goblins, where it's one faction, and the Undead are another faction, and the cultists of the Sponge Cake are a third faction that have all just sort of found their home in the Mega Dungeon. And of course, the dwarves who started the whole thing are the fourth faction. And sometimes those factions get along, and sometimes they're fighting each other. And the players have the ability to use the factions as a resource to become friends with them or to become enemies with them. The players' actions can change the faction's lifestyle, which goes to the next thing. What the players do in the Mega Dungeon tend to change the environment of the Mega Dungeon. What you do actually has a lasting effect. If you go in and kill every goblin in rooms 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, that's, you know, a bunch of empty rooms that eventually something else is going to go, hey, free rent, and move in. So when they come back to that section a month, a year later, and they're thinking, hey, we're going to be safe in these empty rooms because we cleared them out. Nope. Something's moved in. So there's, again, that fluid nature, that random, almost mythic quality. Where are they coming from? Well, it's a Mega Dungeon. It doesn't really matter. I can hand wave it because I've already established that there's a lot of different ways to get into the Mega Dungeon. And bears hibernate in caves. So why is there a bear? It saw a cave and went in, and next thing you know, it was in the Mega Dungeon. Don't ask questions. There's a summoning chamber at the bottom level that some crazy wizard built. The necromancers were experimenting, and the zombies got out, you know. Another thing is emptiness. Mega Dungeons will have empty rooms. They will have huge chunks of just empty space that you can fill in with whatever weirdness you want. It has to give that atmosphere of size. This is a big place with a lot of going on. And, you know, sometimes there's rooms that just are there and nobody remembers why they're there or what their purpose is. And you just stumble across this room and there's a whole story in this just empty room. And maybe there's nothing in the room but some scraps. Maybe there's some strange construction or ancient writings or a weird altar. Emptiness. And the final thing about Mega Dungeons is they can be weird. Mega Dungeons are your chance to just kind of stretch the imagination, stretch the weirdness. You can have those bizarre Rube Goldberg, Indiana Jones level traps because somebody was there and had the time and wherewithal to want to build it because they could. You could have those weird Dungeons and Dragons classic things like talking statues and bizarre riddles and bizarre monsters and things that don't really make sense. There's just sort of that level of otherworldly, mystical underworld weirdness that lets you to sort of stretch your imagination. It's a good place to put the things that don't always fit. So again, I'm not trying to step on Harmony's toes here. I'm not going to cover stuff she others covered. But one question we need to ask is, does a mega dungeon work in today's gaming environment? I mean, we can love the idea of mega dungeons, but actual practice of going through a mega dungeon, they tend to be a slog. I don't think mega dungeons work online. I've been in 3, 4 mega dungeon games online over the past 6, 8 years. None of them worked. They all just ended up being frustrating slogs of just 33 more rooms. Oh my God. And we have to explore every inch of every. Yeah, they never work and they always fall apart. Now, live play, I've been in a couple mega dungeon games that they did work. So I don't know. Do they work today? I mean, yeah, they can become really boring unless they're exceptionally done. A lot of them are really boring. There's a lot of mega dungeons, but few of them are very, very good. And what makes a very, very good mega dungeon is that it has to keep you invested. It has to be more than just a slog of kill the monsters, take the treasures, explore every room, because that becomes boring and repetitive and mundane. And if you think killing every monster and searching every inch of a room is boring and mundane and a waste of time in a 5-room dungeon, imagine doing that amongst 8 people in a 500-room dungeon, and you've only got 3 hours a week to play, and you're like, oh, okay, I guess I searched this chamber, and I got to write down everything we find, and then we got to deal with encumbrance and, economy, how many torches do I, and those empty rooms and those miles and miles and miles and miles can become boring. So I need a reason to keep going back. I need a sensation that that place is alive and it has stories to tell. It keeps me interested. And just throwing wave after wave after wave of monster at me is going to be exciting at first, but by the 5th, 6th game, when it's obvious the DM has no idea how to run this, and you're like, this is just a slog. It's just, oh my God, I don't even want to engage. I'm just. So yeah, it's got to be interesting. There's got to be something fun. There's got to be reasons to run away. There's got to be reasons to come back. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And it doubly doesn't work online, because then the slog has become even longer because of the time of the communication, and you've got to switch the maps back and first, and each of the 8 players has got to do their thing, and then every mega dungeon I've been through online failed. All these, I'm an OG game master and I know how to run mega dungeons and it'll be exciting. And no, there were boring slogs that didn't work. But in the past, mega dungeons I've been through did work. I even got to go through Hargrave's God Home when I was a kid. So, and I've been through Janelle's Thracia mega dungeon. So they can work, but they have to be well written. And they have to be exciting. And you have to give me a reason to keep coming back. Now, my solution, the last time I ran a mega dungeon, which worked, I think, was I didn't run it as a mega dungeon. I ran it as just a bunch of interconnected baby adventures. Right? Which is, I think, the Borrow Maze guy does that too. With his mega dungeons, when they're not just one big, but there's lots of little dungeons on the surface, and each of the areas are sort of their own independent thing that just have to be connected. So they never knew the last time I ran a mega dungeon that they were in a mega dungeon until like 5, 6 games in, when they started to get the idea that, oh, wow, wait, these are all connected. His first Borrow Maze, I've been through Borrow Maze once, and it was a horrible slog, but that could have been the game master in the group. But I've heard nothing but good things about his stuff after Borrow Maze. But what Greg does, thanks for reminding me his name, is it's lots of little baby adventures built on top of the idea that this is all just interconnected big adventure. So you could go into the Temple of the Lizard King, explore it, And then maybe there's something in the temple of the middle Lizard King that connects you to the larger mega dungeon. Or maybe it's just separate and has nothing to do, but it's just in the same area. That's how Borrow Maze and Gillespie's other dungeons work, where there are baby dungeons that are part of the larger story and baby dungeons that aren't. They're just their own little self-contained thing, but they're all kind of in the same hex crawl area. So that's how I ran it. And if I was ever going to run a mega dungeon again, first I'd have to be sure everybody was okay with it. I mean, I'm running a hex crawl now, so that's sort of like a mega dungeon. I mean, I'm running the Slumbering Czar, which is a gigantic hex crawl. Hex crawls are just outdoor mega dungeons, right? Sort of, not really. That's a separate video. So that would be my solution. If you were thinking of doing a mega dungeon campaign, is to read through it, get a true feel of the individual stories, and then run them as a bunch of baby adventures. Like, so maybe you tell them we're doing a mega dungeon. Maybe you don't tell them a mega dungeon. You could run it without ever telling them it's a mega dungeon, because the way it's presented, it can be presented like just a bunch of little stories that slowly interconnect to become a bigger story, that slowly interconnect to become a much larger story. And then suddenly the realization that, oh no, these are the Mides of Moria. These are the caverns of Thracia. This is Rapanathuk. We're in the, it's the Slumbering Czar, and it's all one story. Borrow Maze, Greg Gillespie's, was a lot of little baby dungeons that also were connected to the bigger dungeon, and the bigger dungeon had little teeny sections that could each be run independently, so it didn't have that feel of a slog. At least that's the way it was written. I love the way Borrow Maze is written. Unfortunately, when I ran through it, the DM didn't really get it. So that would be my one solution. In order to make a mega dungeon work, especially in today's environment, is it's got to be consistently interesting, and it's got to not feel like a slog. It's got to just sort of feel like just, reasonably small adventures that we can encapsulate in 1 3-hour session, or, a month's worth of 3-hour sessions and stuff like that. I don't know. I'm sure Harmony does a much better job of explaining this with her 4 friends. How come I wasn't invited, Harmony? But I wanted to cover it because apparently it's the flavor of the week. Again, Daniel, I disagree with you. I don't think Temple of Elemental Evil is a mega dungeon because it tells a finite story. And once that finite story is done, there's no real reason to go back. Borrow Maze or some of the other mega dungeons that I consider are mega dungeons have a very fluid story. The players change things through their actions. The actions of the factions change things. There's multiple reasons to go back. You could repeatedly go back to Rapanathuk for the entire campaign. You could repeatedly do an entire campaign around Borrow Maze or some of the good ones. The Slumbering Czar is an entire 1st through 20th level epic mega hex crawl mega dungeon that of course also is connected to Rapanathuk. There's some spoilers for you. So yeah, I would love to play through a mega dungeon if anybody ever invited me, and I'd love to run one again with the right group. So there we go. I'm talking about it because I'm trying to keep my minds off the election. That's it, because it's lunchtime. Stay safe out there, and I will talk to you all later. See ya. Which music should we end with? Probably.